Clara slumped against the cold bars of the holding cell, clutching a blood-soaked notebook to her chest, while the sirens of social services wailed in the distance, carrying her grandson away. Her side throbbed where the jagged metal had torn her flesh. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the final sentence scrawled in her mother's elegant, manic script. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a warning. As the heavy steel door echoed with a final, soul-crushing clang, Clara realized the McAllister shadow wasn't a mental illness or a family myth. It was a physical destination, a dark coordinate in the old coal mines where her mother had gone to hide a secret that was now swallowing Clara's daughter whole. The duty officer sneered through the plexiglass, unaware that the woman he'd just tackled and processed was staring at a map drawn in human grief. Clara looked down at her stained hands, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Her mother hadn't died of natural causes, and the Dr. Aris, mentioned in every frantic entry, was currently standing in the police station lobby, talking to her sister. She had less than an hour to escape a locked cell and stop her family from walking into the same trap that had buried her mother 20 years ago. The water in the attic was still rising, the house was collapsing, and the only person who knew the truth was being erased by the very people sworn to protect her. The pipe hissed like a cornered animal, water jetting between Clara's fingers as she clamped the wrench tighter. Rust flaked onto her palms, gritty and warm. Her shirt clung to her back, the damp fabric sticking to her skin like a second layer of exhaustion. The attic air was thick, a wet blanket pressing down, each breath tasting of mildew and old insulation. She twisted the wrench again. Nothing. The gush didn't slow. The copper line had hairline fractures that wept a steady, rhythmic pulse, mocking her efforts. Every time she tightened the valve, the pressure seemed to find a new, weaker exit. The sweltering Kentucky heat had turned the enclosed space into a kiln, and the humidity was a physical weight, making her lungs feel heavy and inefficient. Sweat stung her eyes, mixing with the grime on her forehead. She tried to wedge a rubber seal into the joint, but her hands were shaking from the strain. The water was winning. It wasn't just a leak anymore. It was an invasion, a relentless overflow that threatened to dissolve the very floor beneath her. She felt the plywood groan, the wood fibers gorging themselves on the spray until they swelled and buckled. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration sharp against her thigh. She ignored it, focusing on the metallic screech of the wrench. The water kept coming, pooling around her knees, soaking through her jeans until the denim felt like lead. The attic groaned. Somewhere below, a floorboard snapped under the weight of the flood. She should have called the super last week, should have fixed the damn pipe before it turned into this. The phone buzzed again, then again. 3 rapid pulses. Clara exhaled through her nose, sharp and frustrated. She yanked the device out, the screen smeared with damp fingerprints. 911, overdose, student, critical. The words blurred for a second. She blinked, but the letters stayed the same. It was Marcus, a boy she'd been counseling for 6 months. A kid who liked charcoal sketching and hated his father. The clinical reality of the message crashed into her domestic disaster. The mental image of Marcus, blue-lipped and shivering on some dirty bathroom floor, made the rising water in the attic seem almost trivial. Yet the two crises felt connected. A singular, drowning pressure that defined her life. She wiped her hands on her thighs, leaving dark smudges, and began a frantic, clumsy dance across the attic floor. There were crates everywhere. Cardboard boxes from her move 3 years ago that she'd never had the heart to unpack. She grabbed a plastic bin filled with tax returns and shoved it toward the dry patch near the stairs, her boots splashing in the inch-deep pool. The physical labor was a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of her order. She saw a box of old photographs, the edges already curling and darkening with moisture, and let out a small, strangled sound. It was the feeling of her history dissolving in real time. Each crate she dragged felt heavier than the last, the wet cardboard tearing under her grip. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She was a counselor. She was supposed to be the steady hand, the one who navigated the storms. But here she was, losing a battle against a few gallons of Kentucky rainwater and a rusted pipe. In the furthest corner, tucked behind a wall of moth-eaten wool blankets that smelled of cedar and rot, she saw a shadow that didn't belong. It was a wooden crate, sturdier than the others, its surface scarred and dark. She hadn't seen it in years, maybe decades. She cleared away the sodden blankets, her fingers catching on the rough wool, and felt a strange, cold prickle of unease. This was her father's corner, the place where he'd stowed the things that were too heavy to carry, but too precious to burn. She gripped the edge of the crate and pulled. It resisted at first, stuck to the floor by years of dust and the new, sticky grip of the flood. But then it gave way, with a wet, sucking sound. She dragged it into the sickly yellow light of the single hanging bulb. The wood was weathered, the grain deep and ancient, and as she stared at it, the sound of the leaking pipe seemed to recede into a dull, distant hum. The latch was rusted shut, a stubborn eye that refused to open. Clara grabbed the wrench she'd dropped and hammered at it, the metallic clangs echoing through the rafters. With a final, violent snap, the lock broke. She pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in yellowed wax paper, were dozens of notebooks. She picked one up, the leather cover cool and damp. Opening the first page, she felt the air leave her lungs. The handwriting was unmistakable, the elegant, surgical precision of her mother, Evelyn. These weren't recipes or grocery lists. They were dated sessions, transcripts of thoughts, a private cartography of a mind Clara had never been allowed to map. Evelyn had been dead for 20 years, taking her silences to the grave. Yet here she was, whispering from the pages. Clara turned a leaf, her eyes catching fragments of sentences. The walls are breathing again. The shadow doesn't leave when the lights go on. The sound of the front door slamming reached her even through the attic floorboards. It was a violent, familiar sound, the kind that preceded a storm. Clara! The voice was high, frayed at the edges, and vibrating with a frantic energy that made Clara's stomach knot. It was Jolene. Clara scrambled toward the pull-down stairs, her knees cracking. When she reached the landing, she saw her daughter standing in the entryway, and the sight was like a physical blow. Jolene was disheveled, her dyed black hair matted and sticking to her forehead, her oversized hoodie stained with something dark. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown, darting around the room as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. She was shivering despite the Kentucky heat, a fine, rhythmic tremor that spoke of exhaustion and something much deeper. She didn't have the baby with her. Clara felt a cold spike of terror. Jolene looked like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. A vivid portrait of postpartum collapse. "Jolene, honey, where's the baby? Where's Toby?" Clara stepped forward, hands outstretched. But Jolene recoiled as if Clara were made of fire. "I need money, Clara. Just 150. I just need to get the car fixed." Jolene rasped, her voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. She wouldn't look Clara in the eye, her gaze fixed instead on the kitchen counter, the mail, the floor, anywhere but at her mother. "Talk to me. You're shaking. Let's sit down. Let's get you some water," Clara urged, her counselor voice kicking in, that measured low tone she used for the jumpers and the addicts. But Jolene wasn't a client. She was her blood. And the professional distance Clara tried to maintain shattered instantly. Jolene's hostility was a wall, thick and spiked. She began to pace the small living room, her movements jerky and erratic, as a caged animal sensing the bars for the first time. She refused to answer about the baby, her silence a sharp weapon that cut through Clara's remaining composure. Jolene's eyes suddenly locked on the stairs, then moved upward to where the attic hatch hung open. She saw the wooden crate Clara had dragged to the edge of the opening. "What's that? Did you find the stash?" Dad always said there was money hidden in the eaves. Before Clara could stop her, Jolene was on the ladder, climbing with a frantic, desperate strength. "Jolene, no. Those are just books. It's not money." Clara scrambled after her, but she was slower, her wet clothes dragging at her limbs. By the time she reached the attic, Jolene was already kneeling by the crate, her hands tearing through the wax paper. "You're lying. You always keep the good stuff for yourself." Jolene screamed, her voice cracking. She grabbed a handful of the journals, tossing them aside when she realized they weren't envelopes of cash. "Stop it. Those are your grandmother's." Clara lunged, grabbing Jolene's wrists. The two women collided, a tangle of limbs and resentment in the cramped, humid space. The water lapped at their knees as they wrestled for control of the crate. It was a primal, ugly struggle, the culmination of years of unspoken grievances. Jolene's strength was fueled by a manic desperation, her fingernails digging into Clara's forearms. They rolled across the warped plywood, the journals scattering like dead birds into the rising water. "Let go of me," Jolene shrieked. She planted her feet and gave a violent, two-handed shove. Clara, caught off balance on the slick floor, flew backward. Her back hit the sharp, rusted edge of a metal shelving unit. The pain was immediate and white-hot, a jagged tooth of steel sinking into the flesh of her side. She gasped, the air whistling in her throat, and slumped against the shelf. She reached back, her hand coming away slick and dark with blood. Jolene stood over her, chest heaving, her eyes suddenly clearing as the reality of what she'd done began to seep in. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the relentless hiss of the broken pipe and the drip of blood onto the wet wood. Jolene turned and fled, her boots clattering down the wooden stairs. Clara stayed slumped against the shelf, clutching her side, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Her hand brushed against a single notebook that had landed in her lap, shielded from the water by her own body. It was a small black volume, the leather cracked with age. She opened it with trembling fingers, her blood smudging the edge of the cream-colored paper. Her eyes skipped over the elegant script until they landed on a passage near the middle. "It is not just sadness. It is a weight in the marrow. My mother called it the McAllister shadow. It waits in the blood, a dark inheritance that skips the heart but poisons the mind. I see it starting in Clara. I see the way she holds her breath." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wound. The shadow. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a diagnosis of their very existence. A supernatural stain that Evelyn had tried to document before it consumed her. She turned the page, searching for a name, a date, anything to anchor this madness. At the bottom of every entry, there was a formal notation. Submitted for review to Dr. Aris. Clara stared at the name until it burned into her retinas. Dr. Aris. She remembered her father, his face like a closed door, telling her after the funeral that their mother had never sought help. She was just tired, Clara. There were no doctors. No one could have saved her because there was nothing to save her from. The lie was 20 years old, a massive structural deception that had formed the foundation of Clara's life. Her father had erased the only man who might have understood the rot in their blood. As the water continued to rise in the attic, Clara realized that the flood wasn't just in the pipes. It was the past, finally breaking through the walls she'd built to keep it out. The next morning, the adrenaline had faded into a dull, throbbing ache in her side. Clara descended into the basement, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She needed to see the cost of her negligence. When the light hit the far wall, she let out a soft, broken groan. The foundation was weeping. Massive, jagged cracks had spiderwebbed across the concrete, some wide enough to fit a finger into. The pressure from the saturated ground outside, combined with the internal deluge from the attic, had pushed the house to its breaking point. The integrity of the structure was gone. She could almost hear the house screaming under the weight of the mountain, the ancient Kentucky earth reclaiming the space. It wasn't just a repair job anymore. It was a collapse. The house, like her family, was built on shifting ground, and the rain had finally turned the dirt to sludge. The knock on the door was official. 3 sharp, rhythmic raps that didn't wait for an invitation. Clara opened it to find a man in a neon vest, a clipboard tucked under his arm like a shield. He didn't look at her. He looked at the sagging porch, the watermarks on the siding, the way the front door didn't quite sit square in its frame. "Ma'am, I'm with the county building department. We got a call about a structural hazard." He stepped past her without asking, his boots loud on the warped floorboards. He spent 10 minutes in the basement and 5 in the attic. When he came back down, his face was set in that grim, bureaucratic mask of someone delivering a death sentence. "The foundation's compromised. Main support beam is bowing. I'm tagging the property. You've got 48 hours to clear out your personals before we cut the utilities. It isn't safe for habitation, ma'am. Not by a long shot." He handed her a bright orange notice, the ink still fresh, and walked out into the humid morning air. 48 hours. Her life was being condensed into a 2-day countdown. She didn't have time to mourn the house. She ran to the nursery, her heart hammering. "Jolene?" The room was cold. The crib was empty, the blankets tossed aside in a frantic heap. Toby's favorite stuffed bear, a one-eyed thing with a missing ear, lay on the floor, abandoned. Clara checked the driveway. Jolene's beat-up sedan was gone, leaving only 2 muddy ruts in the gravel. She tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. The robotic greeting a mocking reminder of her daughter's absence. She was alone in a condemned house, surrounded by the ghosts of her mother's journals and the very real threat of her daughter's unraveling. The isolation was a physical weight, a silence so loud it made her ears ring. She stood in the center of the kitchen, clutching the orange notice, and felt the first true wave of panic. The silence was shattered by the sound of a car spraying gravel in the driveway. A door slammed, hard. Sarah marched into the house, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't look like a sister. She looked like an inquisitor. "Where is it, Clara? Where's the crate?" "Sarah, I don't have time for this. The house is being condemned. Jolene is gone with the baby." "I don't care about the house," Sarah shouted, her voice echoing off the thin walls. "I know you found them. Dad told me what she was doing before she died. He told me she was writing down things that never happened, crazy things. You have no right to dig this up. You're going to burn them, or I will." Sarah's desperation was jagged, a mirror of the very darkness she claimed didn't exist. She wanted the journals destroyed, not to protect their mother's dignity, but to protect the fragile lies she'd lived in for 2 decades. "I'm not burning them," Clara said, her voice dropping to that low, dangerous growl. She was reaching out for help, Sarah. She was seeing someone, a Dr. Aris. Dad lied to us. Dad saved us, Sarah countered, stepping into Clara's personal space, the scent of stale coffee and something chemical, sharp and medicinal, clinging to her. He kept us from being the crazy McAllister girls. You want to drag her through the mud? You want the whole town to know what was in her head? The argument was a well-worn path, a cycle of blame and denial that had defined their relationship since the funeral. Trust was a foreign concept in this room, a bridge that had burned down so long ago that neither of them remembered the way across. Night fell like a shroud, and with it came the cold. The house, stripped of its warmth, seemed to inhale the damp mountain air. Clara huddled on the sofa, the black journal in her lap, but she couldn't focus on the words. She kept hearing things: the creak of a floorboard in the hallway, the rattle of a window pane. She checked her watch. It was 3 a.m. A sudden, sharp draft cut through the living room, smelling of wet earth and pine. She stood up, her skin prickling. The front door was standing wide open. The darkness of the Kentucky woods stared back at her, a vast, hungry mouth. She knew she'd locked it. She'd turned the deadbolt herself. She walked to the threshold, her heart a drum in her ears, and pulled the door shut, leaning her weight against it. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, as if the house itself were watching her, waiting for her to notice the next change. She turned back to the room and froze. On the floor by the fireplace, the framed photograph of Evelyn, the one where she was looking away from the camera, her lips painted that bruised red, lay face down. Clara picked it up. The glass was shattered into 1,000 glittering shards, a spider web of cracks radiating from her mother's heart. There was no one in the house. No wind could have knocked it from the mantel with such force. The paranoia she'd spent her career helping others manage now took root in her own mind. The McAllister shadow wasn't just a metaphor for depression. It was a presence, a weight that had followed them from the mines to this house, and now it was making itself known. She clutched the broken frame to her chest, the glass biting into her palms, and realized she was no longer just a counselor. She was a witness. By morning, the sky had bruised into a deep, stormy purple. The rain returned, a relentless Appalachian downpour that turned the yard into a quagmire. Clara was hauling the wooden crate toward her car, her boots sinking into the muck, when Sarah's truck skidded to a halt at the edge of the road. Sarah jumped out, her coat flapping like wings. She didn't say a word. She just lunged for the crate. "Give it to me, Clara. It's over." "Get back, Sarah." They grappled in the mud, two grown women sliding and clawing in the dirt. The rain-slicked wood was impossible to hold. The crate tumbled from their grip, spilling into the mud. They fell with it, the slurry of Kentucky earth soaking into their clothes. Sarah's fingers found Clara's hair, pulling back, her face twisted in a mask of primal rage. It was a desperate, ugly scrap, stripped of all sisterly pretense. Clara shoved Sarah back, her hand catching on Sarah's open coat. She pinned her sister against the side of the car, breathing hard, the rain washing the mud from her face in jagged streaks. As Sarah struggled, something heavy fell from her pocket. A plastic bottle hit the gravel with a hollow clack, followed by another, then another. They lay there in the mud, amber vials with white caps. Clara looked down, her eyes widening. She recognized the names on the labels: oxycodone, hydrocodone. The dosages were high, the refill dates too frequent. The very crisis Clara fought at the clinic every day was staring up at her from the dirt at her sister's feet. Sarah went still, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a hollow, haunting shame. "Sarah." Clara's voice was a whisper, the anger replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. "How long?" Sarah didn't answer. She just leaned her head against the cold metal of the car, the rain matting her mousy hair to her skull. She looked old, older than their mother had ever been. Clara saw the tremors in Sarah's hands, the sallow cast to her skin that she'd mistaken for simple exhaustion. Sarah wasn't just protecting their mother's reputation. She was protecting her own supply, her own numb sanctuary. The dynamic shifted in an instant. The shadow wasn't just in the journals, it was in the pills, in the way they all found a way to drown without ever touching the water. Clara reached out, not to fight, but to steady her sister, realizing that they were both drowning in different parts of the same ocean. She left Sarah shivering in the rain and retreated to the car, pulling the journals with her. She sat in the driver's seat, the heater blasting, and began to tear at the leather lining of the black notebook. Something was buried here. She felt a stiff square of parchment hidden between the layers. She peeled it back, her breath catching. It was a hand-drawn map, the ink faded but the lines firm. It didn't lead to a bank or a house. It traced the serpentine paths of the old abandoned coal mines on the edge of town, ending at a chamber marked with a single, heavy X. Next to it, in her mother's hand, were the words, "Where the shadow sleeps, where the silence began." It wasn't a metaphor. It was a location. The source of the rot wasn't in their heads. It was in the earth. And Clara finally had a map to the heart of it. The phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet of the car. It was a woman from social services, her voice clipped and professional, the kind of voice that dismantled families over a lunch break. "Ms. McAllister? I'm calling regarding your daughter, Jolene. She was picked up an hour ago at the CVS on Main. There was an incident. She's currently in custody at the county station. Is the baby okay? Where's Toby?" Clara's heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. "The infant is fine, but given the circumstances, and the fact that your primary residence has been flagged as unsafe, we've had to place him in temporary emergency foster care. We'll need you to come down for a formal interview. But I have to be honest, Clara. Until that house is stabilized and your daughter is evaluated, the state cannot release him to family." The world tilted. The baby, the only clean thing left in their bloodline, was in a stranger's arms. The shadow had claimed another generation, and Clara was standing in the mud, powerless to stop it. She drove to the house, but she didn't go inside. She stood in the yard, looking at the sagging porch. She had a few bags of quick-set concrete and some heavy-duty jacks she'd rented. But as she looked at the bowing walls, she realized the futility of it. The house was a corpse. You couldn't brace a ghost. The physical collapse of the structure was just a mirror of the total disintegration of her family. She'd spent her life trying to maintain a facade of stability, a counselor who could fix anyone's problems but her own. Now, the walls were literally falling, and her grandson was a ward of the state. She slumped against the rusted swing set, the chains groaning in the wind, and felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on her. Sarah's truck was still in the driveway, but Sarah was gone, likely retreated to her own house to numb the shame. Clara was alone. She went back to the car and pulled out the journals, sitting in the dark as the rain drummed on the roof. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages for anything, any scrap of hope. She found it in a small entry from 1985. "We went to the clearing today, the one behind the old oak. For 3 hours, the shadow was gone." Clara laughed. Sarah sang. "We were just people. If I could stay there in that light, maybe the blood would clear." The clearing. Clara remembered it. A patch of wild clover and dappled sun where the air felt thin and sweet. It was the only memory she had, where her mother didn't look like she was waiting for a blow. She realized then that this memory wasn't just a nostalgic fragment. It was the emotional key. Jolene didn't need a counselor. She didn't need a lecture on her situation. She needed to be reminded that there was a place where the shadow didn't reach. She needed to know that their history wasn't just a list of suicides and addictions, but that there was a clearing in the woods where they had once been whole. Clara clutched the journal to her chest. She had to get to the station. She had to break through the wall of Jolene's rage before the state took the baby for good. She wasn't going to fix her daughter. She was going to find her. The county station was a squat, ugly building that smelled of floor wax and old coffee. Clara walked up to the high desk, her wet clothes dripping on the linoleum. The duty officer was a man named Holloway, a man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too many McAllisters over the years. "I need to see my daughter, Jolene McAllister." "Not happening, Clara," Holloway said, not looking up from his paperwork. "She's volatile. Broke a window at the pharmacy, bit a deputy. She's in the cooling-off period. Come back in the morning." "I don't have until morning. They took her baby. You know what happens to kids in the system around here." Clara's voice rose, the controlled counselor slipping away, replaced by a mother's desperation. "I know the rules, and I know your family," Holloway countered, finally looking up. His gaze was cold, clinical. "You're the one with the condemned house, right? You're in no position to be making demands. Go home, get some sleep." The bureaucracy was a wall, unyielding and indifferent. It didn't care about McAllister's shadows or secret journals. It only cared about protocols and property tags. Clara felt something snap. The years of being the good sister, the professional, the rock, just dissolved. She didn't think. She just moved. She stepped around the edge of the high desk, her boots squeaking on the floor. "Hey, get back here!" Holloway shouted. But Clara was already through the swinging door that led to the holding cells. She saw Jolene through a small plexiglass window, a small, huddled figure on a metal bench, her head in her hands. "Jolene, it's Mom." She didn't get any further. Holloway's meaty hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. He didn't hesitate. He slammed her against the concrete wall, the impact rattling her teeth. "That's it. You're done." He spun her around, her arm twisted painfully behind her back. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped shut on her wrists. He dragged her to the cell opposite Jolene's and shoved her in. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. She sat on the cold metal bench, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Across the hall, Jolene looked up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "Mom, I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Clara leaned her head against the bars. She had the black journal tucked into her waistband, the only thing they hadn't taken. She pulled it out with her bound hands and began to read the final entry, the one she'd been afraid to finish. "I cannot stay. The shadow is not something I can fight. It is what I am. If I leave, maybe the infection stops with me. My death is the only gift I have left for my girls. I will go to the water and take the darkness with me." Clara felt a sob rise in her throat, a jagged thing that tore at her chest. Her mother hadn't been weak. She'd been a martyr to a lie. She thought she was the poison, when the real poison was the silence that followed her. Clara looked at Jolene, who was staring at her through the bars, and realized she was making the same mistake. She'd been trying to fix Jolene from a distance, treating her like a problem to be solved rather than a daughter to be loved. Her savior complex was just another version of her father's silence, a way to control the narrative instead of facing the truth. She was trapped in a cell. Her house was falling down, and she was about to lose everything. But as she looked at the journal in her hands, she realized the shadow only had power in the dark. "Not Holloway," Clara called out, her voice steady now, devoid of the panic. The officer appeared, his face red with lingering anger. Clara didn't yell. She didn't plead. She looked him in the eye and spoke with the quiet, devastating clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I know you've seen this 100 times. I know you think we're just another family of addicts and losers. But I need you to listen. Not to the counselor, but to the woman whose mother died in a bathtub 20 years ago because she was too scared to speak." She began to talk, using every skill she'd ever learned to de-escalate the man, to find the human being behind the badge. She told him about the journals, about Sarah's pills, about the clearing in the woods. She made herself vulnerable, stripping away the professional armor until she was just a woman in a wet shirt, begging for a chance to break a cycle. Holloway stared at her for a long time. The silence in the station was absolute. Slowly, he reached for his keys. "If I do this, and you blow it, I'll personally see to it that you never work in this county again." "I understand," Clara said. He opened the cell. He didn't let her go. He called Sarah. An hour later, Sarah arrived, her eyes red, her movements slow. She signed the release papers with a trembling hand, avoiding Holloway's gaze. They walked out into the gray morning, the three McAllister women, reunited in a police station parking lot. "We're going to the diner," Clara said. "The one on the corner. Social Services is bringing Toby for the final meeting before the hearing. We're going to sit down and we're going to talk. No lies, no fixing, just the truth." The diner was nearly empty, the smell of burnt grease and cheap coffee hanging in the air. They sat in a corner booth, Clara, Sarah, and Jolene. The social worker sat at the next table, holding the baby, her eyes watchful. Clara placed the wooden crate on the table. It was scarred, muddy, and smelled of the flood, but it felt like an altar. "This ends today," Clara said. She opened the journals and began to read aloud. She read about the code of silence their father had enforced. She read about the McAllister shadow, but this time she explained it. It wasn't a curse, Jolene. It was the weight of what we weren't allowed to say. It was the shame of being human in a house that demanded perfection. Sarah suddenly put her head in her hands, a low, keening sound escaping her. "I found her," she whispered. The words were so small Clara almost missed them. "I was the one who found her in the tub. Dad told me to go outside. He told me he'd take care of it, and that I should never, ever tell you what I saw. I spent 3 hours cleaning the floor before you got home from school. I scrubbed the grout until my fingers bled. The silence that followed was visceral." Clara reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. The stoicism, the fixing, the distance, it all just evaporated. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry I let you carry that alone." Jolene was crying now, too. But they weren't the frantic tears of the previous night. They were quiet, cleansing. She looked at the journals, then at her mother. "I thought I was crazy. I thought the darkness I felt after Toby was born was the shadow coming for me. I thought I was turning into her." "You're not turning into her," Clara said. "You're healing for her. We all are." Clara turned to the social worker. She didn't give a professional report. She gave a confession. She admitted her home was gone, but she proposed a plan, a real one. Sarah would go to rehab. Jolene would start a program for postpartum depression. And Clara would stop being the savior and start being a sister and a mother. She used the journals as evidence, not of madness, but of a family finally choosing to breathe. The social worker looked at the three women, haggard, muddy, and broken, but for the first time, truly together. She looked at the baby, then back at Clara. We'll start with a 90-day supervised placement, with Sarah as the co-guardian, provided she checks in. It's a start, Clara. A week later, Clara sat on her sagging porch. The house was still condemned, but a crew was in the basement, the sound of rhythmic hammering a sign of new supports being driven into the earth. The rain had stopped. The Kentucky mud was drying under a pale, persistent sun. She looked out toward the woods, toward the clearing she knew was there, just beyond the oak trees. The McAllister shadow hadn't vanished because the mountain had moved. It had vanished because they'd turned on the lights. She held Toby in her arms, his small heart beating against her own, and watched the light filter through the trees. The silence was gone, replaced by the messy, difficult, and beautiful sound of a family finally telling the truth.